What if um, entire sophisticated human cultures thrived during the Ice Age,
Mm,
but on land that's now hundreds of feet underwater?
yeah, it sounds almost like, legends, Atlantis, that kind of thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But could there actually be a solid scientific basis for something like that? These lost civilizations swallowed by the sea.
It's a really compelling idea, actually. And what's fascinating is while there's growing evidence suggesting it's maybe not just fantasy,
That
we're going to dive into what researchers are calling the Coast People hypothesis. Now, look, this isn't about finding one specific mythical city.
right, not like a treasure map.
No, no. It's more a powerful concept, a framework, really, a way to explore how humans adapted to this dramatically different world of the last glacial maximum, the LGM.
LGM, that was what, roughly 30,000 to 15,000 years ago?
Exactly, a really long stretch of time.
Okay, let's unpack this then. So our mission today is to really dig into how scientifically plausible this whole coast people idea actually is. We'll look at the Ice Age environment, the technologies they might have had, whether they could have had complex society.
The impact when the seas rose.
Right, that massive change. And I mean, what underwater archaeology is finding now.
Hmm.
So think of this as your shortcut, to getting a handle on this really mind-bending possibility about our deep past.
And if you step back, look at the big picture. The LGM was just a period of massive global change, huge ice sheets,
Sucking up vast amounts of water.
enormous amounts, so much that sea levels plummeted. We're talking a staggering 400 feet, 120 to 130 meters lower than today.
Wow, 130 meters.
Yeah. And this wasn't just like a slightly bigger beach. It fundamentally reshaped the world map. Millions of square kilometers of land were exposed.
Aliens, could you give a sense of scale?
Well, imagine Europe being about 40% larger.
40%. That's
Yeah.
like adding another France or more.
Easily.
Yeah.
And these weren't necessarily, frozen wastelands everywhere.
Right, that's what our sources are saying. They could have
Right.
been these incredibly resource-rich zones, these triple interfaces.
Exactly. Where marine, terrestrial, and often freshwater environments all met. These could have been crucial refuges.
For people and animals.
For both, yeah. Driving some really specialized adaptations. So let's dive into what these drowned realms might actually have been like.
Okay.
So that massive sea level drop, it had effects everywhere. Think about Florida. The peninsula would have been way bigger.
And fresh water closer to the coast.
Much closer, yeah, which is key. But it varied a lot regionally. The climate wasn't the same everywhere on these new coasts.
Okay, like southern Africa. Our sources mention Waterfall Bluff. People living there right through this period, 35,000 down to 10,000 years ago.
Yeah, continuous occupation even while inland areas got drier. They were clearly good at using both land and sea resources. And the Agulhas Bank offshore, now underwater.
That would have been a huge plain.
An enormous plain, yes. Potential prime territory.
And elsewhere. North Africa.
Actually, more humid conditions along the coast there, supporting mixed forests. Then you go to Southeast Asia, Sundaland.
Sundaland. That huge landmass connecting the mainland to islands like Borneo and Java.
Right, a massive area, about the size of Europe again. And the environment there was really diverse, some drier savanna-like areas, but also rainforests, like in Borneo.
And there's that cave, Pilinduk Cave,
Yeah.
on Talawan.
Yes. Really fascinating evidence there from the LGM. Specialized deer hunting, eating freshwater snails.
And they were carrying marine shells inland from a coastline that's now miles away.
Quite a distance, yeah. Shows a definite connection to and use of that now drowned LGM coast.
Which kind of ties into the Americas too, right? The whole Kelp Highway idea for migration down the coast.
No, it really does. Potential habitats off Florida, California, Hawaii, those areas would have looked very different.
And we have sites like Tricky Island, around 14,000 years old.
And submerged sites near Hawaii, too. Plus, the early date for Monteverde down in Chile, it strongly suggests people were using coastal routes early on.
Can't forget Sahel either. Australia and New Guinea connected.
Colonized incredibly early, 65,000 years ago, maybe even earlier. Which itself tells you something about seafaring ability way back then.
Absolutely. Crossing open water.
Significant crossings. And during the LGM, huge parts of that Sahul Shelf were exposed land. Most of the places people lived then are probably underwater now. Until about 7,000 years ago, that was the main landscape.
So much history just submerged.
A vast amount. And even in Northwest Europe, you had Doggerland.
The land bridge connecting Britain to the continent.
Exactly, a broad plain. Now, a lot of the famous finds there are later Mesolithic, but the landscape itself, formed by that LGM sea level drop.
And crucially, there was fresh water on these shelves, right? Rivers extending out, springs.
Extended river systems, coastal springs, freshwater lenses, yeah, made them much more viable for settlement than you might think.
So it wasn't just dry land, it was livable land.
Potentially very livable.
And, importantly, our sources stress.
Hmm.
We shouldn't picture one single coast people culture, should we?
No, definitely not. The environments were too varied. You'd expect a whole spectrum of different coastal cultures, each adapted to their specific bit of coastline.
A mosaic of adaptations.
Precisely. And another key point. The LGM lasted a long time. That period of low sea levels, we're talking millennia, roughly 30,000 down to 15,000 years ago.
So plenty of time for cultures to develop.
Ample time for deep cultural roots, specialized knowledge, maybe even, more complex societies to develop in place.
Okay, so the environment was potentially there.
Yeah.
What about the tech? Were people back then, Upper Paleolithic people, actually capable of mastering these coastal environments? What tools did they have?
Well, in the Upper Paleolithic was a time of major technological innovation, a real explosion. We see sophisticated use of bone and antler.
Like harpoons. For fishing or marine mammals.
Exactly. Harpoons, eyed needles, think sewing warm, waterproof clothing alls for working hides, and specialized projectile points, getting much more refined for hunting.
And stone tools. They were obviously masters of that.
Oh, absolutely. Blade technology was very efficient, producing sharp, standardized tools. Obsidian, where they could get it.
Like those Japanese blades, 36,000 years old.
Yeah, great example. And composite tools, too, hafting points onto shafts, made hunting weapons much more effective.
But what about the stuff that usually rots away? The sources talk about a perishable record, weaving wood. What do we know about that?
Ah, yes. This is where it gets really interesting, but tricky. Direct evidence is rare, obviously.
But not non-existent.
Not quite. We have indirect clues, like impressions left on bits of fired clay.
From where?
Sites like Dolny, Vistanis, and Pavlov in Europe, dated around 25,000, 27,000 years ago.
And what do these impressions show?
Amazing detail, actually. Different kinds of cordage, knotted netting like for fishing nets or bags, wicker basketry, even woven textiles.
Woven textiles, like with looms.
Well, some of the weaves, like plain weave, strongly suggest some kind of loom technology, yes, using plant fibers, animal sinew.
And they used ochre a lot for art. Could they
Yeah.
have dyed textile?
It's certainly possible. It suggests a pretty sophisticated level of fiber technology, not just basic string.
That's incredible. Okay, what about wood? We know much earlier hominins worked wood.
Right, woodworking goes way back. So while actual LGM wooden artifacts are super rare because wood usually decays, it's highly probable. Upper Paleolithic people were skilled woodworkers.
Especially with wood being available in many coastal areas.
Exactly. So the idea of them making, say, dugout canoes, sleds, baskets, wooden tools, it's technologically feasible. And actually, sometimes underwater sites are the best places for preserving wood.
Right, the conditions are right, anoxic mud and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So boats seem crucial for this whole coast people idea. What's the evidence for watercraft back then?
Well, the strongest evidence, as we touched on, is getting to places like Sahul, over 50,000 years ago. That required crossing significant stretches of water, multiple times.
Could no walk there.
Definitely not. Same for settling islands in Wallachia. It implies maritime skills existed early on.
But we don't have an LGM boat, do we?
No intact LGM boat, no. But we can infer the types. Simple rafts, maybe. Early dugouts, the oldest definite one is much later, the Pessie canoe. But earlier ones are likely. Skin boats, perhaps hides stretched on frames.
So the fact they reached these places.
Strongly implies they had effective watercraft. Good enough for fishing, coastal travel, maybe even exchange between groups.
It really makes you think about this idea of a perishables revolution, doesn't it? Sophisticated weaving, woodworking. Maybe that was key to unlocking coastal living.
It could well have been a major factor, yeah. Enabling denser populations, maybe more complex societies.
And those exposed shelves. You called them coastal highways earlier.
Some researchers use that term, yes. They could have really facilitated connections, spreading ideas, technologies.
So not just isolated groups inventing things, but maybe sharing knowledge along the coasts.
It's likely a mix of both. Independent innovation and diffusion along these dynamic LGM coastlines.
Okay, environment, check. Technology, check, sounds plausible. But what about the people themselves? Socially, culturally? Could these coast people have been more complex than we usually imagine for Ice Age hunter-gatherers?
That's the big question, and where we rely more on inference. Language is the foundation, of course.
And we assume they had fully developed language by then.
The consensus is yes. Definitely by the Upper Paleolithic. Absolutely essential for transmitting complex knowledge navigation, resources, tool-making, social rules, history, all through oral tradition. Storytelling would have been vital.
And beyond spoken language,
Uh-huh.
symbolic stuff, art, decoration.
Oh, yeah, the Upper Paleolithic sees an absolute explosion of symbolic expression. We all know the famous Venus figurines, right?
Yeah.
And personal ornaments, beads, pendants made of bone, shell, and of course the cave paintings in Europe, starting around 35,000 years ago. Just incredible.
Was that just a European thing?
Not at all. We find comparable complexity elsewhere. Look at Wallachia again, Lingbulubitu. Between 30,000 and 22,000 years ago, they had baburza tooth beads, bone pendants, incised stones, processing ochre.
So similar symbolic depth, just different materials, maybe?
Exactly. Shows rich symbolic lives weren't confined to one region. And the coast people, they could easily have used perishable materials for symbolic expression too. Wood carvings, decorated bark, leather, maybe even tattoos. Stuff that just wouldn't survive.
Harder to find, yeah. What about rituals? Beliefs, can we see hints of that?
Burial practices offer some clues. They become more elaborate in the Upper Paleolithic.
How so?
We start seeing grave goods buried with people, the use of ochre sprinkled on bodies, bodies placed in specific positions, formal graves being dug.
Like those amazing burials at Sungir in Russia.
Exactly like Sungir. Very elaborate. This suggests complex beliefs about death, the afterlife, maybe even some form of ancestor veneration.
And caves, were they just shelters or maybe more?
Caves definitely seem to have held special ritual significance. The parietal art is one thing, but sites like Manod Cave in the Levant suggest communal rituals happening inside. There's an engraved boulder, evidence of fire, maybe even acoustics played a role, around 37,000 years ago.
Wow. And what about megaliths? Big stone structures. Göbekli Tepe comes to mind, though it's later.
Right. Göbekli Tepe is crucial because it's around 11,600 years old before agriculture and shows hunter-gatherers building massive monuments.
So could similar earlier structures have existed on those coastal plains, now underwater?
It's speculative, but Göbekli Tepe proves the capability was there. Direct evidence would be very hard to find now, obviously. Submerged or eroded.
And plant use, medicine, maybe even psychoactive stuff.
We're seeing more evidence for sophisticated plant knowledge way back. Medicinal plants used by Neanderthals even. Later on, things like beetle vine, potentially psychoactive, around 13,000 BP in Timor. Poisons used for hunting in South Africa, 24,500 years ago.
So the botanical knowledge was there.
The knowledge was likely there. So the potential for using psychotropic plants, maybe in shamanic traditions, it's plausible.
It really seems like these rich coastal zones could have supported larger groups, maybe more settled.
That's the idea. Resource concentration could allow for larger populations, maybe less mobility, which often fosters more social complexity, maybe territoriality.
And communal rituals to keep everyone together.
Possibly, yeah. Like Minot Cave, perhaps. The landscape itself, the coast, could have become deeply imbued with symbolic meaning, tied into their myths, their rituals.
Which makes the thought of losing it all even more profound. That inundation must have been catastrophic.
Absolutely. The loss of those landscapes. It wouldn't just be losing territory. It would be a deep, deep cultural trauma.
So let's talk about that. The Great Inundation, the end of the Ice Age, the seas rising. What did that actually look like?
Well, the big warming trend kicked in after the Younger Dryas cold snap, around 11,700 years ago. But the rise actually started much earlier after the LGM peaked around 21,000 years ago.
And it rose by that full 120, 130 meters.
Eventually, yeah, reaching near modern levels by maybe 7,000 to 5,000 years ago. But crucially, it wasn't always slow and steady.
There were faster periods, meltwater pulses.
Exactly. Periods of accelerated melting that could have caused relatively rapid flooding of low-lying areas. Think about Florida losing huge chunks of its expanded landmass fairly quickly during these pulses.
Just devastating for anyone living there. Settlements, sacred sites near the coast, gone.
Relentlessly consumed. Homes, hunting grounds, fishing spots, freshwater sources near the coast, maybe ritual sites, all inundated, forcing people to move constantly.
Losing not just land, but their whole world, their resource base.
Precisely. Especially those low-lying areas, which were likely the most productive and heavily settled. They'd go first. And the changing climate also disrupted the ecosystems themselves.
Flora, fauna changing.
Right. Forcing more adaptation, pushing people inland, maybe along the shrinking coastlines,
Right.
leading to potential conflict or merging with inland groups. We see hints of this in places like Southern Africa and Southeast Asia.
And imagine the loss of knowledge. All that specialized coastal know-how, The stories, the identities.
Huge potential for fragmentation and loss, yeah. Especially if societies collapsed or were absorbed. And their material culture, especially the perishable stuff, very vulnerable to being destroyed by the rising water and waves.
Though you said it wasn't necessarily instantaneous everywhere,
Yeah.
more like a long goodbye.
In many places, yes. A gradual rise over centuries, maybe averaging something like a meter or so per century overall, but with those faster pulses. Still, even a slow rise means generation after generation having to repeatedly relocate, adapt, reconfigure their whole society. Huge stress.
Maybe reflected in oral traditions. Flood stories?
Could be. That slow loss might be encoded in some myths.
But were there any places people could retreat to? Like islands forming as the water rose?
Definitely. Higher elevation areas on the shelves would have become islands, temporary refuges. Dogger Bank in the North Sea is the classic example. It was an island for thousands of years before finally sinking around maybe 7,000 years ago.
So some groups might have held on there for a while.
Possibly. Maintaining traditions in isolation, maybe eventually migrating to new mainlands or adapting to island life. You could maybe see something like the Jomon culture in Japan adapting to rising seas around their archipelago from 16,500 BP onwards as a parallel process.
Wow, it just paints this incredible picture. Entire worlds vanishing, survivors carrying just echoes,
Yeah.
which makes finding actual evidence underwater so critical. How is underwater archaeology tackling this?
Well, the scale is just immense, mind-boggling, really. Thousands of submerged prehistoric sites are known, but that's surely just the tip of the iceberg, given how much land went under.
Millions of square kilometers.
Millions. But the potential reward is huge. Preservation.
Of organic stuff, wood, fibers.
Exactly. In the right conditions, low oxygen sediments, you can get amazing preservation of materials that almost never survive on land from this period. Crucial for understanding the coast people.
But finding these sites must be like looking for a needle in a haystack and super expensive.
It is incredibly challenging, yes. Discovery is often accidental dredging, construction, and the flooding itself could destroy sites or bury them deep. Working underwater needs specialized gear, ships, ROVs. It's costly.
But the tech is getting better.
Much better. High-resolution sonar can map the seabed in amazing detail. Sub-bottom profilers can see below the seabed. LiDAR works in shallow water. We're getting better at predicting where sites might be. It really needs a multidisciplinary approach, though. Geologists, archaeologists, climate scientists.
Have there been some successes? Discoveries that give us a glimpse?
Oh, definitely. Doggerland, as mentioned, has yielded Mesolithic tools, mapped riverbeds, the Baltic Sea submerged settlements, even incredibly preserved wooden fish traps.
Fish traps.
Yeah. The Mediterranean has submerged Neolithic sites, obsidian tools showing old land connections. The Florida Shelf is revealing preserved Ice Age landscapes, potential artifacts. And the northwest coast of North America, sites like Kilauea have preserved organics underwater. It proves important stuff can survive down there.
And thinking about parallels on land. Göbekli Tepe again, the Jomon pottery.
The really important reference points. Göbekli Tepe shows hunter-gatherers could organize for massive projects pre-agriculture. Jomon shows early pottery, complex adaptations in a coastal setting right around the end of the LGM. They make the idea of sophisticated coast people much more plausible.
And the early seafaring to Sahol, Wallachia. That's undeniable proof of boat tech.
Undeniable. They had the means to travel by water very early on.
What about myths? Flood legends, do they fit in here?
It's tempting, isn't it? So many cultures have flood myths. While each has its own context, the sheer universality might reflect a deep ancestral memory of that post-glacial sea level rise. It's hard to prove, but suggestive.
Migration legends, too. Ancient DNA tracing people back.
Those are becoming powerful tools, yes. Linking oral traditions to genetic histories, potentially tracing movements from now submerged areas. It's a rapidly developing field.
What about weird stuff? Those out-of-place artifacts or oparts people sometimes talk about.
Well, you have to be really careful there. Approach those claims with a lot of scientific rigor and skepticism. Genuine anomalies could challenge paradigms, but they need rock-solid evidence and context. Usually they don't hold up.
And the fact that things preserve differently underwater, the taphonomic filter.
Exactly. Water tends to preserve hard things, stone, bone best. Organics need special conditions. So the record we find is inherently biased. We have to understand what's likely missing. Sheltered bays might preserve sites better than open coasts, for example.
So Göbekli Tepe and Jomon are better proxies, really.
Huh.
showing the potential for complexity back then.
They offer solid, well-dated evidence for what hunter-gatherer societies were capable of around that time. They justify the search underwater. They make the Coast People hypothesis a really valid, exciting research question.
Okay, so let's pull it all together. How plausible does this Coast People hypothesis look now? It feels like.
Yeah.
Like the circumstantial evidence is mounting, but the smoking gun from underwater is still elusive.
That's a very good summary, I think. Increasingly plausible, yes. Based on environment, technology, known social potential, the pieces fit. But direct, widespread archaeological proof from those specific LGM coastlines, now deep underwater, still limited, they remain, well, an enigma waiting for more discoveries beneath the waves.
But the potential of finding that record, it's huge, isn't it? It could really change how we see the Paleolithic.
Fundamentally, coastal adaptations, populations, migrations, social complexity. It's not just about finding more sites. It could rewrite major narratives.
So what needs to happen next? Where does the research go?
The sources point to several key things: more focused underwater surveys, targeting those high-potential LGM zones, Sundaland, Sahul, India, Japan, North Sea, Beringia, the Americas shelves.
Advair Tech.
Continued advances in underwater exploration tech, absolutely, making it cheaper, more effective. Also, looking again at land sites that were once further inland, do they show coastal connections?
And re-examining old collections.
Yes. Looking for overlooked clues, subtle evidence of maritime tech or perishable crafts, and crucially, more collaboration across disciplines, across borders.
It really does feel like this is a new frontier, a challenge to our old assumptions about where the main action was happening during the Ice Age.
It really is an invitation to explore the unknown. The sheer amount of land that was lost underwater suggests we could be missing a huge part, maybe even the dominant part, of the human story for that period.
So the search for these lost worlds, it's more than just archaeology.
I think so. It's about understanding human resilience, adaptation to massive environmental change, which feels pretty relevant today, doesn't it?
It certainly does.
Finding these worlds could profoundly reshape our understanding of our ancestors and their legacy, carried forward through millennia of change. The quest continues beneath the waves.